Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm Ukrainian Canadian. Today is May 14th, 2024, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So this is going to be a quick map update, and I'm going to be focusing mainly around the Russian offensive in Kharkiv Oblast. It was announced last Friday. We've talked about it briefly, but there's more developments, more updates, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Donbas and some other map updates there. And then a last comment about what's been going on in the Kremlin this weekend. So let's get to it. So two offensives in Kharkiv. One that is directed towards the city of Kharkiv city. You can see that the Russian push is towards the city. And another one is towards Vovchansk. So this is a smaller city of 15,000 people that the Russians are trying to capture. You can see that here the Russians were able to gain, as I was expecting, and I told you guys last Friday, they managed to gain control over a few of these villages that were right by the border with Russia. And you can see that in the last few days, the Russians have been able to push about 5 to 6 kilometers within this sector. So nothing catastrophic. And as I said, it was expected because, of course, the fighting is not going to be happening right at the border between Russia and Ukraine. It's just physically impossible for the Ukrainians to build some sort of defensive line here. Because of how close it is to Russia. So what is really important for the Ukrainians is to hold the Russians in these positions right now. And I really hope that's going to be the case. You can see that there's some positive news as well, that the Ukrainians were able to liberate the village of Zelene that was previously in the gray zone, and now it's been retaken by the Ukrainians. So there's some positive signs that the Ukrainians can also regain some territory. And I think they're going to be able to hold the Russians around this sector. So I think that this is going to be by default a gray area, and perhaps maybe in the future the Russians won't be able to hold it due to the Ukrainian pressure and will have to move out. You can see that what's really helped the Ukrainians is also this large reservoir around the western air sector of this offensive, where the Russians simply cannot push further unless they kind of go around and try to attack on this side around Vysoka Yaruha. But so far, that's the situation around these villages. You can see that the Russians have taken the village of Gleboke, which means deep in Ukrainian, and another one called Lukyantse. So far, that's the extent of the Russian gains in the last few days since Friday. And I really hope that the Ukrainians will be able to hold the Russians around this sector. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see how that develops. But certainly, I think the Russians perhaps would be able to continue pushing a little bit more, because the next village would be Liptse. So I think that what is problematic here is you can see that there is some heights that if the Ukrainians let go of, this would provide the Russians with a height control over the village of Liptse. So I'll keep you guys updated as to what is going to happen in the next few weeks here. But so far, it's been stabilized by the Ukrainians, and I've heard reports that the Ukrainians have mobilized more resources and have moved some of their troops from the 82nd Brigade and 3rd Assault Brigade in these sectors to stabilize the situation. The other front is, of course, towards Vovchansk. And here, the Ukrainians absolutely need to hold the city. And it's been reported that the Russians have been able to enter the northern sector of Vovchansk. But it's not going to be as easy as the Russians think, because Vovchansk is divided by a river, the Vovcha River, and the Ukrainians also have a good troop presence, and they've mobilized more resources towards this front. They've brought some armored vehicles, and so I think that this is not going to be easy for the Russians. Why is it important for the Ukrainians to hold this city? Is because after Vovchansk, there's pretty much open fields, so this would allow the Russians to perhaps gain even more ground. If they are going to be able to take Vovchansk, which so far doesn't seem to be the case. So this is pretty much the updates in the last few days in this sector. We'll keep a close watch over the developments, but so far it's definitely positive. And as I've said Friday, this is not 2022 anymore, and the Russians simply won't be able to just drive through without any opposition and within a few hours get to Kharkiv like they did back in 2022. That's not the case anymore, and they've had tremendous losses in this sector. And they would have had even greater losses if the Ukrainians were a little bit better prepared. But either way, I'm pretty satisfied with how Ukraine was able to defend itself especially when we're considering that the Ukrainians still haven't been given the green light by the United States to utilize weapons, US weapons, on Russian soil, right? I think the Ukrainians perhaps even knew where the Russians were, their groupings, their staging areas, but they simply could not hit them with, let's say, the ballistic missiles provided by the United States, because, well, that's an escalatory, it's an escalation by Ukraine. We already know the lines of the Biden administration. So, of course, if Ukraine would have been able to utilize them on time, it would have perhaps stopped the Russian incursion from happening. Who knows? But one of the strategy, I think, here, it's still unknown what really the Russians are trying to do here. But I think mainly it's a test. Based on the amount of forces that the Russians have committed here, it's not enough to have a massive breakthrough. I think it's just a test to see how far they can go, and if they were to recreate other offensives, how effective they would be. And as I've said, Sumy, Chernihiv are also at risk from future Russian offensives, right? Perhaps it's an attempt by the Russians to try to stretch out Ukrainian defenses, because we know that it's extremely difficult right now for the Ukrainians in Donbas, that is in Luhansk and Donetsk and parts of Zaporizhia. So, opening another front is really making it more difficult for the Ukrainians, but it's not like it's super easy for the Russians either. That means that the Russians need to allocate more resources towards another front that they're not really interested in having, but I think they're just really are trying to test the Ukrainians and their defenses. Now, additionally, of course, we know that the situation in Bakhmut is very tense, and so far in the last few weeks, the Russians have not been successful in entering the city of Chasiv Yar, which is another area that the Russians are trying to capture, a big important city, of course. And so far, the update here is that, well, the Russians have been stopped around the outskirts of the city of Chasiv Yar, and they're stocked around these forested areas that lead into the city. So that is positive. Additionally, around the area of Avdiivka, you can see that the Russians continue with their pushes around the area of Ocheretine, so that is north of Avdiivka. We've talked about it in the last few weeks. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians lost control over a chunk of territory here because of a bad troop rotation, which allowed the Russians to seize a window of opportunity to push through this railway line that leads into Ocheretine. And then they captured Ocheretine, and they managed to capture some other villages close to this village. But as I can confidently say, the Ukrainians have been able to hold a good position in the outskirts of Ocheretine. It's become very difficult for the Russians to capture more ground here. So the Ukrainians just reinforced their defensive positions in the outskirts of the village of Ocheretine. So this is positive. But of course, the intensity still remains here. You can see the amount of brigades and troops and resources that the Russians have mobilized in this sector alone in Avdiivka. Another push is more south of Donetsk, that is in Krasnohorivka. The Russians are trying to capture this other key city of about 15 to 20,000 people. And you can see that this is where we've seen the Russians utilize their turtle tanks. That is, they weld a bunch of armor on top of the tanks, and they just stick dozens of electronic warfare jammers, and then, they just advance. And to a certain extent, they've been, pretty successful, but that pretty much destroys the utility of these tanks. The MTLBs and the T-62s, they're just meant to drive forward, drop off the troops, and then if they can come back, then so be it, that's great, but most of them get destroyed either way. They just offer better protection than most typical tanks that the Russians use, or armored personnel carriers as well. So here we can see that there's a very small gain by the Russians around this sort of entrance to a park in the center of the city. So that's the situation around Krasnohorivka, but otherwise, that's the situation in Donbas. Another thing I wanted to note is around the area of Novomikhailivka. The Russians conducted a huge offensive today with about 11 to 12 armored vehicles, and they were obliterated. And the positive sign is that I saw in the video that was uploaded by the Ukrainians, or that was released by the Ukrainians, is that you could see a tremendous amount of shells being utilized against this Russian convoy, armored convoy. So that means that these shells have officially started coming in. The Ukrainians are concentrating them on key sectors, and that's really good news because we know that one of the main issues why the Russians have been capable of pushing more than they would have been able to is because the Ukrainians lacked shells, and their main method of stopping these Russian convoys were drones, which we know is not a panacea and simply is not effective enough to stop massive Russian offensives throughout the front line. So now it's positive to see that the Ukrainians have officially started receiving the 155mm shells and can now start utilizing them to obliterate Russian armored assaults. So that's the news for today in terms of the map update. One last update I want to give you guys. Well, Mr. Blinken arrived to Kiev, so that's good news, to offer, again, the United States support to Ukraine. I think it's not the only thing that he came to do. He came, also to discuss various topics behind closed doors with Zelensky. That is how Ukraine can remove corruption from the government. We know that there's every other month there's political scandals and other ministers or officials that are accused of corruption. So that is another war that Ukraine is fighting against. And also, I think one of the several plans that the United States has set up for Ukraine in terms of how they can achieve victory against Russia. We know that in this financial and military assistance bill that was voted last month, the $61 billion aid for Ukraine, that there was an amendment added by the Republicans that indicated that the United States needs to provide Ukraine with a pathway to victory. Not just providing Ukraine weapons and assistance and hoping that they can utilize them best, but actually helping Ukraine guide the Ukraine government towards a path of how they can achieve victory. So I think that this was perhaps presented to Zelensky, several scenarios that the Biden administration is contemplating right now. And the last update is, of course, what's going on in the Kremlin. And I've shared with you guys the news story of Shoigu being demoted this weekend by Putin. So he was the Minister of Defense, and now he has been demoted to the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, whatever that means. And I don't know what the position, the official tasks of this position are, but certainly it's not as prestigious as the defense minister. So clearly this is demotion, and it's a message being sent out by Putin that he's not going to tolerate corruption within the military. Well, we know that Putin himself is the biggest corrupter of them all. He's the richest man on earth because he's been stealing from the Russian taxpayers forever. But one thing that he realizes that he cannot allow to let corruption slip through the military anymore. Something that was acceptable prior to the war is not acceptable anymore. He understands that if he loses this war, due to corruption, of course, and money being funneled out from the budget of the military, that he is going to pay a price with his life, right? The Russians won't forgive Putin for losing the war in Ukraine. And that's why he has removed Shoigu, because Shoigu was taking part of this massive scheme of corruption going on in his ministry. That's why you guys saw the writing was on the wall. A few weeks ago, he arrested Timur Ivanov, who was a close friend of Shoigu, and many others. And now the demotion of Shoigu is kind of this last nail in the coffin. Essentially, Putin is sending a very strong message that he's not going to tolerate any more corruption. And he replaced him with what I believe to be, unfortunately, an improvement, because this person is Andrei Belousov, and he's an economist, an awarded economist, and he's a technocrat, meaning that he's a very capable manager. And I think that Putin understands that it's really important to bring a manager, a person that can better integrate this war economy that Putin has created in Russia and efficiently allocate the funds that have been allocated to the military. And so Andrei Belousov, he believes, is going to be the right person, the right manager that's going to be able to efficiently integrate that war economy within the military as well. So you guys can let me know what you think about that. But another very interesting demotion is Patrushev. And if you guys remember, he is the chief security intelligence chief of the FSB, a very close and influential friend of Putin. But clearly he wasn't that good of a friend if he was demoted, because he's been demoted to the president's aide, and again, I don't know what that means, but clearly it's not as prestigious as being the FSB chief. And I don't think that Patrushev, especially Patrushev, is going to take this lightly, because we know how influential, how powerful this position is. And I think that throughout the years that Patrushev held this position, he's managed to accumulate a tremendous amount of wealth, a tremendous amount of influence and connections. And I don't think it's going to go down so easily. At least that's my personal opinion. You guys can let me know in the comment section what you think. But I think that this could be the start of some internal war within the Kremlin. And Patrushev, I believe, is not going to go down so easily. Perhaps I'm wrong here, but certainly Putin has been very paranoid, and I think that he's behaving exactly like Stalin. That is, you know, whether it be imprisoning or killing off his allies because he simply doesn't trust them. And these are the people that helped him get to power, helped him start this war, and now we're seeing Putin removing them left and right. So clearly, I think that some of them are not going to go down so easily, and we could see perhaps Prigozhin mutiny next few months. Who knows? I mean, it's just a theory, but it's very possible when you're seeing people as powerful as Patrushev being demoted like that. You can see that Putin didn't just, you know, he understands the implication of just removing completely and firing these people. So he kind of gives them these sort of very, you know, let's say other prestigious positions, but they're definitely not as good as what they had previously. Sort of this, you know, for Patrushev, it's like, what is the president's aide mean? Is it like, you know, filling up his cup of coffee every single day? You know, Patrushev had a very good position, and now he's been demoted to this president's aide. So I see that as a very, very big statement by Putin, and one that many elites are not going to be happy about. And so I think that potentially in the next few months, we could start seeing some internal battles in the Kremlin to try to get rid of Putin. Who knows? So that is the video for today, guys. You guys can let me know about what your thoughts are about my last comments about the changes in the Kremlin. Again, a huge thank you for your support. And if you enjoy my content, please subscribe to my channel. And with that, I will leave you guys. Slava Ukraini!